The Most Reverend Jaime Soto, Bishop of the Diocese of Sacramento, presides over a Catholic church comprised of almost 1 million of the faithful, spread over 20 counties and 102 parishes in Northern California. To share his views on the state of the church, faith, and its role in current society, Bishop Jaime Soto joins me next on Studio Sacramento.
At Five Star Bank, community is at the heart of what we do. Every day we strive to have thoughtful solutions for our customers and help our communities prosper. Honest dialogue about the issues affecting the region is vitally important to that prosperity. We are proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
Bishop Soto, how does one come to the epiphany that they want to be a priest?
Well, in my case, the idea of being a priest actually started very young, and that doesn't always necessarily happen nowadays, but I grew up in a very Catholic family and almost kind of in a certain sense kind of a Catholic ghetto, and so
Catholic ghetto, what do you mean?
Well, you know that my family, we hung around family, mostly Catholic, and then we hung around parishioners, and so it was a very Catholic environment that we were immersed in, and so it was. And so for growing up, both my parents were very pious and devout Catholics, and so we were, like it or not, we were in church quite frequently. And as a young boy, I think probably in the second grade is when I kind of began to articulate the idea that I wanted to be a priest. Now, at that time, and I was in Catholic school, yeah, I wasn't the only one. I mean, I think most of the boys were either going to be firemen or a railroad engineer or a priest or a policeman. That was kind of the standard,
Sure.
occupations that people thought about. But as I grew up, I held on to the idea, and I guess for me growing up, that one of the key factors was that my parents never discouraged me in that idea. They always they would introduce me. This is our son. He's gonna be a priest.
Now that notion, I know that refilling the numbers of the priesthood, and for women becoming nuns, has been a challenge, not just in this country, but all over the world,
Right.
With some exceptions of some of the more growth areas of the church in
Africa and
right.
Latin America.
That's right.
Areas, yeah.
What's changed?
Well, I think actually one of the things, not only just in the priesthood or religious vocations, but even that for young people today, I find in conversations with children, young people, that the thought of what they are going to be when they grow up seems they're kind of reluctant to articulate that, or they're
An
not
extended
sure.
childhood almost.
Yeah,
adolescence.
there's and what I often find is that even in high school, that idea doesn't get kind of put together. Usually in college is when young people, that idea of what they will do, for the rest of their lives, or what they will commit themselves to, begins to crystallize, and both not only in terms of what they will do as an occupation or a livelihood, but also even relationships or the commitments they make. And so, but there is I think almost a certain reluctance about commitment in general. And then a commitment like the priesthood, quite frankly, I think for a lot of young people, young men, it seems rather daunting. So.
Yeah. One thing that everyone who's joining us wants to know is, what does a bishop do? What's a typical day for the bishop?
Oh, gosh. Well, actually, I just to digress for a minute. I mean, I usually get that question whenever I visit the high schools. I try to go around and visit all the Catholic high schools that we have in the diocese, and I just go and visit the classrooms and let the kids ask questions, and I get all sorts of questions. but one of the common questions is, so what do you do in a day? The simple answer I have is that there's no typical day for a bishop, and at least in my schedule, every day has kind of got its own set of challenges. But most days are going to have some element of prayer to it, either private or public. It's going to have some element of teaching or preaching, and it's also going to have a good deal of pastoring or being a good steward or a
So you still get to do priest-like things.
Oh, I do, and I think for particularly the prayer part of that, especially private prayer. I mean, that's just not because I'm a bishop. That's just because I'm a human being, and I'm a frail person, and I need that prayer, that contact with God to be good at whatever God wants me to do, and He wants me to be a bishop. So
that's actually refreshing because many people look at priests and other members of the clergy, whatever their faith is, and they tend to think, my gosh, this individual has superhuman control, discipline, whatever it is. It's nice to hear that there's some humanity in there as well.
Well, I think that really the power of the priesthood, and actually in many ways the power of the church, is our ability to be human and finding God in our humanity. Now that and so that challenges us to recognize our own weaknesses and failings, and yet also to discover God's grace and God's strength in those moments. I think I was thinking about this recently. The sacrament of confession, which is kind of a lot of non-Catholics have a hard time figuring that out. Why would you go to another person and talk about your sins or your weaknesses? And yet it's precisely in that very humbling dynamic of having two individuals, two very frail and weak individuals, acknowledge God's mercy and God's grace and the importance of that gives the power to the sacrament. It's not something that I do or that a priest does, but it's hopefully it is something that God does through us.
You talk about mercy, and I'm a parishioner at Good Shepherd Catholic Church in Elk Grove.
Oh, that's great.
And our priest, Father Leon, recently said that this is the Pope's Jubilee year of mercy. What is this Jubilee year of mercy?
Well, I think in some sense it's important to acknowledge that this is Pope Francis who has declared this Jubilee year of mercy. And I think that since the beginning, since he came out on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, and there's been an acknowledgement on his part of his own frail humanity. The first thing he did was ask people to pray for him, to ask God's blessing upon him as he began his ministry as the successor of St. Peter. And so that this Jubilee year of mercy is not just the theme of mercy, but the fact that Pope Francis has chosen to capsulize a lot of what he sees as important for the church in the ministry of mercy. And so he's touched the nerve in declaring this Jubilee year of mercy. And I've been speaking
He has touched a nerve.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about that because he has introduced a lot of conversation based on his own approach to his papacy.
Mm-hmm.
That is, he kind of is reminiscent of Pope John, I think it's the 22nd, and who did the Second Vatican II.
Right.
And then after that, in between, we had Paul and John Paul I and II and Benedict,
Right.
who were perceived as having a far more conservative view on how the church should approach the issues, not only the eternal issues, but the issues of the day. What's the chatter behind the doors with you and your colleagues about this new pope and this energy that's moving in what seems to be a much more expansive direction?
Well, I think, first of all, I think I see a lot of continuity in.
Really?
Yeah, I do. I see a lot of continuity, and in some sense, I guess, if you ask about what's kind of the chatter, and behind the screen or behind the doors about what's going on, and what I think Pope Francis has done is taken a lot of the legacy of John the 23rd, Paul the Sixth, Paul the Sixth, John Paul, Saint John Paul, and Pope Benedict. That he's taken the best of their tradition and presented it in a whole new way that people are hearing the church's message in a way that they could not hear it before. And I think part of the dynamic, part of the beauty of Pope Francis's ministry is that he was elected as Pope directly from being a pastor. So John Paul or Pope Benedict, was had been in the Vatican for a while, and even John Paul was very much kind of quite an intellectual, pastoral, had a very pastoral sense, but also very intellectual individual. But Pope Francis was the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, in a very, how should I say, conflicted state, and with a lot of challenges with poverty, and from in certain sense he's a pastor from the third world, and that he's taken from that context and elected to be the Holy Father, the Pope of the Roman Catholic Church.
It almost sounds like he brings a sense of urgency from being so in touch with what's going on.
Yeah, he does. He's and he also he brings that pastoral sense of and a keen awareness of the poor. I had the opportunity to recommend that to you and to your listeners, a wonderful book called The Great Reformer, and I can't remember the author's name, but it's a biography of Pope Francis, Jorge Mario Bergoglio, up until the time that he's elected Pope Francis. And you get a wonderful insight on how pastoral of a man he was, and his immersion particularly into very poor, desperate communities, and how he served them there. It's that perspective, along with the teachings of John the 23rd, Paul the Sixth, John Paul, St. John Paul, and Pope Benedict, that he now brings it to the church and to the world in a new way.
Well, let's put that in context. There are a couple things going on these days, which at the same time there's this explosion of interest and focus on the new Pope.
Right.
But at the same time, there are some other things, statistics-wise, that are coming out that I'd just like to get your perspective on. There was a Pew study last year that called Americans' Changing Religious Landscape, which said, along with other religions, Catholicism is on the decline in the United States. Now in Europe, in Western Europe in particular, there's been a hollowing out, some might say, of not just Catholicism, but Christianity in total. And so the Pope comes into a moment where it is that secularism and frankly atheism, which in some cases in America almost seems like it's the new cool,
Yeah.
is happening at the same time. How do you think the church and the efforts of the Pope and yourself fit into this era where it seems like faith is, at least in the daily conversation of most people, is diminishing from its historic place?
Yeah. You know, I guess maybe without wanting to sound too repetitive on that, I think one of the beauties of this Jubilee Year of Mercy is that it does, I'll say for myself and also for others, awaken in us the power of focusing in on the ways that the church traditionally communicates itself in American society, which is largely actually our vast network of charitable services, Catholic education, Catholic healthcare. And in the United States, these are three very robust ways that the church communicates the gospel of Jesus Christ to the world in ways that brings hope, comfort, healing, and inspiration to people's lives. And so that, you know, I think the Year of Mercy reminds us as Catholics first of the importance of doing those works well, you know, and that when we can engage society through charitable works, through education, and through healthcare, that we also have the best way of being most persuasive of who we are. That's not to say, particularly in American life today, particularly in California, that those aren't also areas where we're challenged.
You all have had your challenges, dating back from the sex abuse controversies, the decided difference between on Catholic healthcare, on the provision of reproductive services, but at the same time, how does the church essentially stand its ground, but at the same time open its doors when you have all of these cross currents going on at the same time?
I guess one of the things, I mean, you raise a good point. One of my concerns, you know, particularly in the discourse that public discourse that we're having today, is that historically America has been a religious country with a, you know, in a certain sense, kind of a, how should I say, a secular government, you know, the Constitution, in terms of the separation of church and state, that when you read the Constitution in that, it's that the state cannot, you know, recognize a particular religion but that there's no restriction on a religion or a faith community to continue to express their faith in public life. It's the government's intrusion the government is limited in terms of what it can do. So American life, I think, has always been very rich in terms of the plurality of religious expressions, and that those religious expressions really make up the fabric and rhythm of American life.
And that's why this is so fascinating to me. So I want to take you back a couple of years, just a few, okay?
Okay.
When Alexis de Tocqueville, centuries ago, wrote Democracy in America, he wrote, "The religious atmosphere of the country," talking about the United States, "was the first thing that struck me on my arrival. There is no greater country in the world where the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than America."
Yeah.
But that's why the Pew study results were so fascinating to me. What do you think de Tocqueville, if he was touring America today, what do you think his observations would be compared to when he did that centuries ago?
You know, going back to de Tocqueville's work, which is, you read it today, and so many of the themes that he talks about, it's like it's happening today. You see a lot of his
Yes.
concerns being echoed in many of the debates or discourse that we have today. But I think if de Tocqueville was here today, he would caution Americans about being too easy to want to, in a certain sense, imitate the secularism of Europe. Because in a certain sense, the European democracies made a different deal. And
Can you describe that deal?
For example, let's talk about French society. My French is terrible, but the laïté, the certain sense of that. We're a lay society, and religion doesn't have a place in public life, and that's kind of enunciated as a principle, and you see that of a certain stricter restrictions on religious expressions in public life, and to the point that you would seldom, if ever, have a European head of state say what the president would say in most cases of, God bless America. That just wouldn't happen. And so that there was a lot of that is a result of Europeans' history of religious wars. But there was this attempt to kind of a certain suspicion of religious expression. America, in a certain sense, kind of is a mirror reflection of that. In that our history, we wound up getting many of those religious people who were fleeing religious persecution in Europe. They came and found the freedom to express their faith in America, and we, through a lot of trial and error, and a lot of and then also I think some very brilliant minds, crafted a way of life where government has its place, and that it's that there's it's important for government in a certain sense not to support one religion or another, but yet the people that also faith has its place, and religious institutions have their place in American life. And going back to Alexis de Tocqueville, he's actually very critical of the Catholic Church in Europe, and admires the Catholic leadership in America for their way of, in a certain sense, of cooperating with American life and creating a vitality of Catholic expression here in this country that de Tocqueville could no longer find in Europe.
Vitality. And one place that we find vitality is in our youth.
Yeah.
An observation of your diocese is that your diocese has, compared to other parts of the country, a fairly thriving parochial school system all the way through high school. In fact, in this region, among the top high schools are all of the Catholic high schools.
Right.
In terms of performance, and sometimes in terms of sports.
Yeah. St. Francis particularly.
Right.
There.
And that is noteworthy because in other parts of the country, schools are being shuttered, they're being shut down. What makes the parochial school system in this region so successful, especially when things like charter schools allow parents to have essentially a private school education, but with a taxpayer support that the kids that go to your schools don't receive?
Well, I think in some ways that first let me say that here in the Diocese of Sacramento, I feel very fortunate to have the network of schools that we have, and both parochial schools and high schools. But that it is a very challenging environment, and we that's both in many parts we compete against some very good public schools. And also in many parts, we are also competing against very good charter schools. And so we do face our challenges. But I'm grateful that I believe we have strong leadership and a good product, and that people seeing that a good management and good product in terms of education, Catholic education, that people are willing to invest in that, and they're willing to have their children be part of those kinds of institutions, and so. But Catholic education, I mean, we face our challenges here in the state of California, but I think we're also, we benefit from a rather thriving Catholic community throughout the state, which is, again,
increasingly diverse.
Increasingly diverse, and but that, again, in other parts of the country, particularly the Northeast, the urban centers, the population as well as the Catholic population tends to be going down. And that's had a negative effect on parishes as well as schools. Mm-hmm. But here, we're in a situation where, particularly along, as I say, the 80 corridor, there's just continues to be growth. It's been a little bit of a slowdown in recent years, but I think everyone expects that eventually that this region is going to continue to grow.
And we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you, Bishop Soto, for joining us, and much success to you and your work.
Oh, well, thank you. And please pray for me, and I will pray for you, Scott.
It's a deal.
Okay, great.
All right. And that's our show. Thanks to our guests, and thanks to you for watching Studio Sacramento. I'm Scott Syphax. See you next time right here on KVIE.
At Five Star Bank, community is at the heart of what we do. Every day we strive to have thoughtful solutions for our customers and help our communities prosper. Honest dialogue about the issues affecting the region is vitally important to that prosperity. We are proud to be part of the conversation and hope you'll join in.
All episodes of Studio Sacramento, along with other KVIE programs, are available to watch online at kvie.org/video.